our study on applied threat modeling in enterprise environment. So at a very high level, threat modeling is simply a structured approach for identifying risk and developing mitigating strategies for those known risks. And the reason that this is a thing is often in security we deal with very complex problems, so there's not an immediately apparent solution available. So as a result, we use frameworks to digest things into bite-sized portions. Given a particular constraint, limitation in an environment, we come up with the best available solution given the constructs of a framework. So threat modeling as a whole has existed since the dawn of warfare, when man started fighting man. In digital security literature, it's been around for about 30 years. And over the span of those 3 decades, this study represents the very first time that this has actually been measured in an enterprise environment, beyond notional scenarios and outside of the classroom. So we partnered with New York City Cyber Command over the span of 120 days. And for those of you that are not familiar with this organization, this is a citywide government entity that provides network infrastructure services to the over 60 million visitors to New York City every year, the 8.6 million residents, and over 300,000 government employees at the city level. So given that daunting task, we wanted to ask, if we introduce threat modeling into this environment, what would happen? So we broke this study into 6 distinct parts, starting off with the baseline. If you're introducing something, you can't measure change if you don't know what the standard practice is. Secondly, we did an educational intervention. It smelled a lot like a classroom where we brought all the participants in and we taught them the fundamentals of threat modeling. Additionally, we taught them an exemplar threat modeling framework, gave them an opportunity to do some hands-on lab type things and answer some questions they might have had at the conclusion of the 1-hour intervention. The framework that we taught is known as center of gravity. This dates back to the 19th century, actually. And what it is really an optimization framework. You have an adversary. You have a list of assets that you have available to you. How do you optimize what you have to have maximal impact on your adversary? And the product that you produce as a result of this is known as an actionable defense plan. Actionable being the key trigger word here, and that you're identifying mitigating strategies that you can improve the health of your digital security organization using this actionable defense plan. So what this looks like, as the participants walked into the educational intervention session, they were handed a worksheet that sequentially walked them through the center of gravity analysis, giving them hints and cues that were relevant to them as practitioners of security. And then after this, we took all of the participants in a one-on-one session, essentially put them in a room with an observer and asked them to focus on complex problems pertinent to their particular work role for no more than an hour. Next, we gave them a survey in which they could provide anonymous feedback. We also wanted to measure knowledge retention, sentiment towards the framework, and exported all of our output to senior leaders in New York City Cyber Command so that we could actually have a gauge on the accuracy of the output produced. Next, we did a 30-day follow-up survey in which we removed ourselves from the environment, let them play with threat modeling on their own, identify key characteristics they enjoyed, and asked them to provide the feedback after a 30-day period. Lastly, we performed a 120-day comprehensive analysis on the changes that we did in the environment to determine did we actually have a positive impact on the environment. And we did all this to determine 4 key tenets. And all of these are lifted from behavioral psychology studies. First and foremost, we understand perceived efficacy. What do they think about the framework? Because this is directly going to shape the adoption forward. If they just don't like it, they're not going to do it. Next, accuracy. If I were to give any of you this worksheet, having not given you the class, you could do it. But what you actually produce, is it going to be useful? Is it relevant? And that's what we wanted to know with this. And then for actual adoption, what are the lingering things after we did this study that persisted in the environment absent researchers? And lastly, actual efficacy. The things that were instituted as a direct result of this study, did it have any positive impact? So let's dive into the results. So we recruited 25 participants to do the study, which represented 37% of the workforce as of last year when we started. We found that, namely, there were 3 aspects of their current digital security plan. First and foremost, they had a comprehensive commercial solution deployment throughout the environment that looked a lot like defense in depth. Secondly, there was strict adherence to compliance-based standards that were audited frequently, quarterly, sometimes annually, and done recurringly. And lastly, there were industry best practices, either those that were recommended by other security practitioners in the field or those that were recommended from a top-down approach at the federal level as they're investigating incidents and other best practices, things that they recommend that you do in your environment. So getting on to how the participants actually perceive the efficacy of threat modeling in the environment. We found that 12 out of 25 of the participants found something entirely new within their work role, whether this was an asset that they previously weren't monitoring as closely as they should have, or an entirely new threat vector they had not previously considered that would drastically impact their ability to do their job. And I'd like to add an important aspect to this. On average, participants only spent 37 minutes coming up, holistically tailoring this to their work role and developing an actionable defense plan. Secondly, they felt more confident in their ability to actually do their job as a security practitioner. And lastly, they felt empowered that they could communicate their findings of risk and viable solutions for those risks to senior leaders to make the enterprise more healthy. To leave you with a quote, or to give you a quote, this one participant felt that they could plan effectively, document, track, monitor progress, and essentially understand our security posture better through threat modeling. And as I mentioned earlier, as we exported our findings to senior leaders, and they determined that 96% of the actionable defense plans that were created, on average in 37 minutes, were valid. More importantly, there were 147 unique mitigating strategies they identified that would help with the threat landscape that they encounter day in and day out in New York City. 64% of those were either entirely new, like they did not exist in the environment, or another portion where they just didn't sufficiently cover the threat landscape entirely. And lastly, 16 out of 25 of the actionable defense plans had enough technical fidelity in them to be implemented the very next morning, which again is very powerful in 37 minutes of an investment in a one-on-one session. Additionally, we found that no matter what the demographic was, their IT experience, educational background, how long they've been in the organization, no particular demographic enjoyed any statistically significant benefit over one another, meaning that if you've been in the organization for 15 years or you were brand new in onboarding, you had the same likelihood that you were going to have success in applying threat modeling in your individual job. Looking at the things that persisted after we left the environment, there were a number of things, ballpark about 50 that were actually implemented as a result of this study. I want to focus here on 4 of them. First and foremost, a lot of practitioners said, we identified a critical vulnerability in that we have weak passwords and pervasive password reuse in the environment. And one way that we can get after this is using multi-factor authentication. And this was deployed, and here a year later, it is still being rolled out throughout the entire city as a result of this study. One practitioner noted simply the vast scope of our responsibilities in New York City Cyber Command. We can't do our job perfectly every single second of the day. And they're also recognizing there's lots of success with bug bounty programs and vulnerability disclosure programs. And if we could crowdsource some of that goodness to the talent within New York City, I think that we could, again, improve the health of the organization. Thirdly, there were a lot of administrators that said, I'm responsible for the network security of this entire monster, but I don't have visibility on every subdomain that I need. And there's some critical aspects that they didn't have visibility on at all, whether this is logs or sensor placement. And as a result, 13,000 new sensors were deployed throughout the environment in these places that they were blind to previously, thus increasing their situational awareness in the environment. And lastly, there was a process called the change review process that was already organizationally adopted in the environment, where if you wanted to install new software, you want to install a new system in a particular network, that had to go through a risk analysis panel to determine, should we do this in the environment? And administrators identified, hey, we need to be doing this at the lower level, because modifying a configuration file could actually impact 50,000 systems if we fat finger one thing. So identifying that, they are now instituting a second party coming in and validating that was actually modified on a configuration file actually meets the intent of what the administrator was meaning to do. So to give you a side story is probably one of my favorite things about this study. We were doing a one-on-one session, walked out of the room, and we saw two middle-level managers talking about the results of their own sessions. And the comment they made was, we don't need to wait for anyone to really tell us to do this. We can get after this right now. And so we came to work the next morning, and they had converted this entire conference room wall into an urgent priority board. This is sticky note madness everywhere, in which they were identified the low-hanging fruit they can address immediately. And for the ones that required mid to long-range planning, they had progressive plans to get it healthy in these particular assets that were identified as a result of this study. And I'm proud to report that a year later, there aren't sticky notes still on the wall, that they're doing this every 2 weeks, and then matured it to a formal Scrum process in which they're doing demo days for new viable solutions for identified problems, and it's really matured to integrate into everyday life in the organization. So getting after the actual efficacy, how can we say that New York City is quantifiably more secure now because of the study? Well, as I mentioned earlier, we deployed multi-factor authentication in the environment, and the proof of concept was in a domain that had 80 accounts. And over the span of 120 days, we observed that 5 administrator accounts would have been hijacked by a foreign entity had multi-factor authentication not been deployed. Huge. Additionally, the New York City Cyber Command partnered with another bug bounty program to do a 24-hour proof of concept deployment. And in this, the scope was simply one public-facing server. And in the 24-hour period, they had 3 full write-ups of previously unknown vulnerability reports with proof of concept exploits in their inbox. So now this is something that they've matured, and they're looking to do it to broaden the scope and open it up to more participants. As part of the deployment of 13,000 additional sensors in the environment, they identified 541 unique intrusion attempts that would have been successful. And all of these were validated by a human security engineer. They would have been successful had those 13,000 additional sensors not been deployed. So understanding that we had lots of goodness from the study, we're not without our limitations. Namely, as a lot of you are probably thinking right now, we can't say that if we had done attack trees or stride, that it would have been any more or less successful as we introduce it in an environment. The data that we have supports that if you have security practitioners focus proactively on complex problems given a framework, you're going to have success. Secondly, there's demand characteristics that you have to be concerned about. The people that signed up for the study were interested in the study, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. We didn't pay them any additional money. There wasn't any promotion incentives for doing it. This is simply, if you're interested, come hang out. And as part of that, we provided lots of venues for them to provide anonymous feedback. Additionally, we removed ourselves from the environment for 30 days as they can live, breathe, threat modeling themselves without us observing them. And lastly, it's not abundantly clear if we had transplanted this study anywhere else in any other environment that it would have been successful. However, if you were to go to a private corporation versus government or an organization with a smaller scope of responsibility, we feel that you're going to find a lot of the same technologies in these areas. There's going to be a lot of the same compliance-based standards if it's a US-based entity. And lastly, a lot of the best practices are made by community practitioners, which means the grassrootness of it is that it's going to be representative across whatever organization you're going to. So for that, it's highly likely that if you were to do this in a future study, you'd see additional positive results. So in summary, we were able to do this by taking workers away from the keyboard for 1 hour for an educational intervention study. On average, we did a one-on-one sit down with them for 37 minutes and had an immediate impact on the organization without any additional costs. We identified 147 unique mitigating strategies, of which 64% were entirely new to the organization. And New York City is now quantifiably more secure as a result of the study over the span of 120 days. And lastly, we can't overlook the human factors associated with this, that practitioners felt more empowered to communicate risk, viable options to senior leadership, and especially in crisis action planning, that in itself is worth all the study. So before we go into the question and answers, I'd like to thank New York City for making this study possible. My advisor, Dr. Michelle Mazurek, you're amazing. All the co-authors in it, and all the other people in the background that made this possible, especially legally. And I'd like to open it up for questions. Thank you.
Saurabh Bakshi from Purdue. So you mentioned that there's no additional cost. So I can imagine that the training itself did not have additional cost. But what was the cost sensitivity of adoption of some of the security practices like two-factor authentication and so on?
So if you're using soft tokens, that's free. That particular implementation was free. The additional sensors were capabilities they had immediately available to deploy. And again, an essential asset of what we did was look at what do you have available to make immediate impact. We're not worrying about long-range things that you require. We're worried about what do you have right now that can get after the highest vulnerabilities that you have. And so all of these were things they had already in-house.
So even the bug bounty program was already in place? Or was
so that partnership is at no cost to the city of New York. Thank you.
Hey, Rock, great work. Tudor Dimitris from the University of Maryland. You briefly talked about the principles from behavioral psychology that you used in designing your educational intervention. So, these principles have been used in other areas like economics, advertising, etc. So I was wondering if there's something that is specific to security behavior that you have found, or maybe you can speculate if there might be such a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we focused a lot on self-efficacy, how they felt they could actually do a job. We focused a lot on adult learning theory, and mainly that practitioners, especially security ones, learn best through hands-on application. So that I could talk at you for an hour, but unless you actually have hands-on, tangible benefits in your hand of the benefits of doing this, we didn't believe it was going to sink in as well. And we have tons of literature in the paper that support this through decades of research. But we found in this particular scenario, we gave them two practical examples in the educational intervention, and post-study that this was something they were all familiar with, it resonated with them, and helped. Thank you.
I'm just wondering, this is Locke from Air Force Research Laboratory.
Hello.
In terms of, do you have any insights on how effective or how much benefit you get if you repeat the experiment again? Whether or not, like the first time, you're getting a lot of low-hanging fruits, if you institutionalize this periodically, you do a threat modeling, what kind of benefits do you actually get over time?
Yeah, thank you. So this is actually something we were talking about, that over 30 days we saw there was some loss of knowledge. It's one of the detractors of the study, that without routine reinforcement at the organizational level, there's some atrophy of knowledge. And to not answer your question directly, I believe that if this was adopted culturally in an organization and had frequent opportunities to do refresher training or mentorship on, hey, let me see your center of gravity or your assessment of the threat landscape, and having them communicate that routinely to reinforce the knowledge skill sets, I think that'd be hugely beneficial moving forward to do this on a routine basis. Thank you.
Okay, I'd also like to point out that this paper won a Distinguished Paper Award. So thanks, Rock, and thanks to the team.